What if I told you that Roberta Flack, the woman behind some of the most iconic and soulful ballads in history, wasn't the angel the world thinks she was? Sure, she had the voice that melted hearts and the timeless hits that made her a legend, but behind that velvet tone was a career filled with industry battles, betrayals, and a life that didn't always match the picture-perfect image. In fact, her success came with a price that cost her relationships, money, and perhaps even her peace of mind. And in 2025, the world lost her. But was it truly the peaceful ending we all imagined? Stay tuned, because what you thought you knew about Roberta Flack is about to be turned upside down. Roberta Flack's rise to fame seemed almost effortless. At least that's how it looked from the outside. Born in 1939 in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and raised in Washington, D.C., Roberta's early life was a testament to natural talent. A prodigy on both piano and voice, she earned a scholarship to Howard University, where she honed her skills and quickly made a name for herself. By the late 60s, she was signed to Atlantic Records and ready to take the world by storm. Her big break came in 1969 with the release of The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, a song that would go on to define her career. The ballad, drenched in emotion and elegance, catapulted her into the spotlight and earned her a Grammy. It was a moment that defined her as the queen of smooth, jazz-infused soul, adored by fans and critics alike. But here's the thing. While the public adored her, there was a side to Roberta's rise that few ever saw. Yes, she had the voice of an angel, but it was a voice that came with a relentless work ethic, a refusal to play by industry rules, and a series of behind-the-scenes struggles that almost no one talked about. Roberta didn't just waltz into success. She had to fight for it. And though she'd become one of the most respected names in the music industry, her path wasn't as smooth as it seemed. This is where the misconception starts. To the world, Roberta Flack was an unassuming star, a classy, dignified woman who navigated the music world with grace. But behind the scenes, she was battling with record labels, grappling with contractual issues, and refusing to bend to the commercial demands of the industry. Many saw her as an untouchable force of nature, but the truth is, she was constantly on the defensive, fighting to hold on to her art, her autonomy, and her legacy. This public image of the sweet, sophisticated songstress, it wasn't the whole story. Here's the truth nobody wants to talk about. Roberta Flack wasn't the industry's darling. She was a fighter. While the public saw her as the sweet, soft-spoken artist with the velvet voice, behind closed doors, she was anything but. In fact, Roberta's relationship with the music industry was rocky at best. The reality is, she wasn't just playing music. She was playing a high-stakes game against an industry that wanted to own her, mold her, and profit from her voice. Let's start with the most obvious, her label troubles. Roberta's career was marked by her constant struggle with record labels that didn't always see eye to eye with her vision. Take The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face. While it became a massive hit, the song wasn't originally part of her debut album. It was actually a leftover from a previous recording session that almost didn't make it onto the album. Why? Because her label at the time didn't believe in the track. They almost let a piece of music history slip through their fingers, simply because it didn't fit their narrow view of what Roberta should be. And if you think that was a one-off, think again. As her career went on, Roberta clashed with her labels over everything from music direction to album art. She wasn't afraid to push back against the cookie-cutter pop industry machine that tried to box her in. But here's where things get interesting. While the public loved her for being different, the reality was that this very resistance made her career more difficult than it needed to be. Roberta Flack was no one's puppet, and that's exactly why she wasn't the beloved star the public thought she was. She didn't fit into the neat little commercial box they wanted to put her in. While other artists were churning out hits that catered to the mainstream, Roberta stuck to her own style, blending jazz, soul, and pop in a way that spoke to her, not to the industry. That wasn't always a good thing for her career. She often found herself on the outs with the very people who were supposed to support her. Roberta wasn't the model celebrity. She was too independent, too determined to do things her way, even when it meant risking her commercial success. The industry didn't know what to do with her, and while fans loved her authenticity, it wasn't enough to shield her from the harsh realities of the business. Now let's talk about some of the collaborations that people don't always remember, but should. While Roberta Flack's solo career was legendary, she wasn't always a one-woman show. Throughout her career, she worked with some of the biggest names in the business. But here's the kicker. Those partnerships weren't always as magical as the final product might suggest. Take her iconic partnership with Donny Hathaway. Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway remains a landmark album in the R&B and soul genres. But behind the beautiful harmonies and soul-stirring lyrics, there was a complicated, even tragic, undercurrent. Hathaway was struggling with mental health issues during this time, and it didn't take long for those issues to cast a shadow on the collaboration. Many people saw their duo as the pinnacle of soul music, an effortless fusion of talent. But what they didn't see was Roberta's growing frustration and emotional toll as Hathaway's mental health deteriorated. And of course, we all know how the story ended. Hathaway tragically passed away in 1979. But was it just the loss of a musical partner, or was there something more? For Roberta, Hathaway's death was devastating, not just personally, but professionally. The music industry and fans alike were left to wonder what could have been. But what's often overlooked is that Roberta was left to shoulder a lot of the emotional weight alone. She had to mourn him in public, all while the world kept demanding more from her. It was a burden she carried quietly for years, and many don't realize how much this loss impacted her career. Then, there's the story of her time with the legendary producer and musician Quincy Jones. While they worked together in the early 70s, their collaborations often left a bitter aftertaste for Flack. She reportedly didn't always see eye to eye with Jones's production style, and while some of their work was critically acclaimed, Flack often felt that her musical vision was compromised in the name of commercial appeal. Let's not forget the industry's tendency to take and take, all while leaving the artist with nothing but scraps. Roberta's collaborations were often marred by this very issue: label pressure, creative control being pulled away, and other artists or producers stepping in with their own agendas. These collaborations didn't always lead to long-lasting relationships or artistic satisfaction. In fact, some of them left her feeling like an afterthought in a world that had no real interest in giving her the control she deserved. The collaborations might have made her famous, but they also set her up for a series of disappointments, each one leaving her more disillusioned with the business that made her a star. What many fans didn't realize was that every iconic track came with its own layer of struggle and betrayal. Now let's talk about something most people don't know about Roberta Flack: her constant battle with money and the music business. Despite her incredible success, Flack wasn't immune to the dark side of the industry, where artists are often at the mercy of shady contracts, royalty disputes, and financial mismanagement. And believe me, Roberta's financial struggles weren't just some minor hiccup. They were a recurring nightmare that followed her throughout her career. Let's go back to the 70s and 80s, when Roberta was riding high off her hits like Killing Me Softly and The Closer I Get to You. You'd think that by this point she'd be raking in the cash, right? Wrong. Despite selling millions of albums, Roberta faced crippling financial issues that were largely due to bad record deals. The label that had profited off her voice for years had also signed her to some of the most exploitative contracts in the business. It didn't take long for her to realize she was getting the short end of the stick. Now, if you're thinking she could just renegotiate or walk away, well, that's easier said than done. Roberta wasn't exactly in a position of power to demand better deals. The industry was ruled by a few big players, and they held all the cards. If she wanted to keep making music, she had to play along, even if that meant walking away with a fraction of the profits her music was generating. It wasn't until years later that she began to take control of her own destiny. But by then, the damage was already done. The legal battles continued into the 90s and 2000s. Roberta found herself locked in multiple lawsuits over unpaid royalties and licensing issues. You see, back then, artists were often forced into situations where they had to fight for what was rightfully theirs, without much support from anyone. For Roberta, this fight became a personal one. She took her grievances to court on more than one occasion, challenging the very system that had taken advantage of her. And while she did manage to win some battles, the toll it took on her both financially and emotionally was immense. One of the biggest blows came when Roberta sued her former label, Capitol Records, for the rights to her music catalog. After years of being denied proper payment for her contributions, she wanted to set the record straight. But of course, the industry was more focused on keeping control of the money than acknowledging the artist behind the music. These legal struggles were draining, but Roberta didn't back down. Still, despite these fights, Roberta's wealth didn't reflect her status in the music world. Her estimated net worth, even by the time of her death, was around $25 million, far less than what she should have earned considering the size of her influence. So, While fans sang her praises and the industry revered her as a living legend, the reality was that Roberta was financially struggling, trying to piece together the remnants of a career that was marked more by legal battles than by its actual musical legacy. All these years later, it's clear that Roberta Flack wasn't just an artist robbed of royalties. She was a symbol of how the music industry continues to mistreat its creators, no matter how big they are. She had to fight tooth and nail to get what was rightfully hers, and even then, the industry never truly gave her the credit she deserved. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Roberta Flack's struggles weren't just about the industry. Beneath the surface, she was dealing with personal demons that few people knew about. She wasn't the pristine, untouchable icon everyone thought her to be. Behind the scenes, Roberta's life was a whirlwind of emotional battles, health crises, and quiet pain. Let's talk about her health. In the 2010s, Roberta's physical health began to decline. But this wasn't just the typical aging process. This was a devastating battle that most of the public never saw. She started to experience serious vision problems, which worsened over time and eventually left her with partial blindness. For someone who'd built her career around not just her voice, but her visual presence as well, this was a crushing blow. Not only did it make her life difficult, but it also made it nearly impossible to continue performing live as she once had. Her final years would never see the grand stages she once graced, but the toll didn't stop there. Roberta also suffered from speech difficulties, another result of her health battles. In a career where her voice was her instrument, losing control of that meant she was stripped of part of her identity. She found herself in the fight of her life, not just against the labels that had exploited her, but against her own body. And while she continued to work on her music, it became clear that the woman who had once dazzled millions on stage was now struggling to simply hold on to her health and her place in the public eye. What's even more heartbreaking is how isolated Roberta became during these years. The once vibrant vocal presence in the industry started to fade into the background, and those who had once been close to her, collaborators, friends, even family, started to drift away. A quiet loneliness seemed to follow her in her final years, and it became clear that she was living with a kind of emotional and physical exhaustion that no one really talked about. This wasn't just the decline of a legend. It was the gradual unraveling of a woman who had spent decades giving everything to her art, only to be left in the shadows when she needed support the most. And let's not forget about the toll her personal life took. Roberta was famously private about her relationships, but there were whispers of family tension and unspoken regrets. In particular, her relationship with her only son, who was born in the 1970s, became strained as the years went on. She never publicly addressed the breakdown, but those who were close to her knew that the relationship was a source of deep emotional pain. By the time Roberta was in her late 70s, she was a shadow of the woman who once commanded the stage. She had fought to reclaim control of her music, her finances, and her health, but in the end, it was clear that her personal battles had taken their toll. The woman who had once been unstoppable was now in a quiet, invisible fight to hold on to her dignity and legacy. So while the world saw Roberta Flack as an icon, many of us missed the true cost of her success. The public never knew the full story of her personal battles, health struggles, family conflict, and the quiet agony of a career that had been both a gift and a curse. As we approach the final chapter of Roberta Flack's life, it's impossible to ignore the heartbreaking reality that her last years were marked by a fight for survival, not just against the physical ailments that had long plagued her, but against the slow fade from a world that had once adored her. The woman whose voice once captured the hearts of millions was now struggling to simply keep her legacy alive. But it wasn't just her health that was failing. Roberta was also battling the mental and emotional weight of a career that had left her both fulfilled and broken. In her later years, Flack's health issues became more than just a nuisance. She had lost much of her sight due to macular degeneration, making it difficult to read music and perform, something that had defined her entire career. The very thing that made her unique, the sheer presence of her musical performance, was now compromised. She was no longer able to create or deliver her music in the same way, and that loss was more devastating than anyone realized. But even as her physical health deteriorated, Roberta didn't give up on her art. In 2020, despite everything, she recorded a tribute album to Donny Hathaway, reflecting on their years of collaboration and honoring his memory in the only way she knew how, through music. This final act of creation was not just a professional choice, but a personal one. It was her way of reaffirming that no matter the state of her health, the music would always be a part of her. She was determined to leave something behind, something that could prove to the world that she was still Roberta Flack, still capable of touching hearts with a single note. However, even as she worked on this final project, she was forced to confront the fact that she couldn't keep up with the demands of the industry or even the expectations of her fans. The Roberta Flack that the world remembered, the one who performed with fire and grace, was no longer a part of the public's reality. She was now a legend relegated to the shadows of her own career, fighting to preserve her identity while the world moved on without her. And it wasn't just her health and career that were deteriorating. It was her connection to the very thing that made her famous. The music industry. By the time of her hospitalization in 2024, there were no grand public tributes, no spotlight on the woman who once stood at the top of the charts, commanding attention with every note. The silence that followed her was deafening. The music industry, which had once adored her, now seemed almost indifferent to her struggles. When Roberta Flack passed away in 2025, it was a quiet, somber departure, far from the grand celebrations that usually accompany the death of a musical icon. The world had not been prepared for the loss, nor had it truly recognized the toll that the industry had taken on her life. Despite all her accolades, all her accomplishments, Roberta was not afforded the kind of grand, public farewell that so many other artists receive. Her passing marked the end of an era, but it also underscored something darker. In the final years of her life, Roberta was left to grapple with the emotional scars and physical limitations of a career that had demanded so much of her. She was a woman who had given everything to music, only to watch as the world moved on without her, leaving her to fight for her place in the spotlight she once commanded. In the end, Roberta Flack wasn't just a victim of health decline or industry neglect. She was a casualty of the very system that once made her a star. And as we reflect on her life and career, we have to ask, how much of her true legacy did we really understand? How many of us truly knew the struggles behind the music? Her last days were spent quietly, in a fight to maintain the legacy she'd built. But her battle, like so many of her battles, remains largely unspoken. And in that silence, we can't help but wonder what could have been if only the industry had cared more about her as a person than as a product. So what will Roberta Flack ultimately be remembered for? Is it her unparalleled voice that once captivated millions? Or is it the trials and tribulations that made up her complicated journey through the music industry? The truth is, it's a little bit of both. Despite the struggles she faced, Roberta's musical legacy is undeniable. Her voice became the soundtrack of an entire generation, and her contributions to soul, jazz, and pop music will forever be etched in history. Killing Me Softly with his song, The Closer I Get to You, and Feel Like Making Love are just a few of the tracks that continue to be revered as some of the finest examples of vocal artistry. Even in her final years, Roberta's influence was undeniable, and she managed to inspire a new generation of musicians who would go on to cite her as an influence. But Roberta Flack's legacy isn't just about the music. It's also about the way she stood up for her artistic integrity in a system that often sought to exploit her. Her refusal to bow to commercial pressures and her willingness to fight for her creative vision set her apart from many of her contemporaries. She was never just a product of the industry. She was a force that refused to be controlled. By the time of her death in 2025, Roberta's estimated net worth was $25 million, far less than what she truly deserved for the talent and heart she poured into her music. But even though her financial worth doesn't fully reflect the impact she had on the music world, her legacy is priceless. Roberta Flack wasn't just a singer. She was an artist who defied the odds, built her own path, and left a mark on the world that will never fade. In the end, Roberta Flack will be remembered for much more than the hits she created. She'll be remembered for the battles she fought, the music that transcended generations, and the woman who gave her all to a world that wasn't always kind to her. Rest in peace, Roberta. You might have been overlooked by many, but you'll never be forgotten.